This patch is frankly massive. Star-Lord, Master of the Sun, has been a card people have debated about nerfs on for a while, and they have finally pulled the trigger on a nerf I think basically nobody expected, making him a 5/8. So he's definitely not going to be a combo card anymore, but in exchange, he gains a very large body. And I'm of two minds about a change like this, because on the one hand, I think that this takes a lot of what people invested in Star-Lord and says, this doesn't really work anymore. If you were someone who was playing him in Mr. Negative, if you were playing the traditional Star-Lord builds, where you're looking to play a Star-Lord on 4, then Zola or Grandmaster or Absorbing Manet, those things are no longer in his wheelhouse. On the other hand, if you were looking to play the biggest and best 5-drop in a high evolutionary deck, he definitely is filling that role now. 5/8 is just a crazy stat line because it gives him a very large body to go along with a beneficial effect while taking a lot of the combo elements out of the card. But unfortunately, when you're in a situation like this with Star-Lord, I think there is something to be said for it is quite a risky thing to take away a lot of the things people have built around the card and change the foundation of the card to being a totally different thing. I would say this is probably the riskiest balance change they've made since the Mr. Fantastic First Steps nerf, which, as we all know, because I can't stop talking about it, was voted in my end of year awards the worst nerf in Marvel Snap in 2025. My supposition is that the reason for that is because it took a card that a lot of people had a lot of things built around, and it made that card no longer fill that role. Now, I do think that they have done a better job keeping Star-Lord as a card people may play, just in a more limited role that is not aggressively doing something ridiculous. But I also think that this is just generally not a good pattern for them to get into. The fact that they felt they needed to do something as drastic to Star-Lord as they did is indicative of failures in the process of arriving at Star-Lord's original cost and ability. I do think that this is a better card to exist, and I don't want this to sound like I'm the Star-Lord defense force. I just think that this is a very risky change to make because so many people have built around this card. I don't think the Mr. Fantastic comparison is one-to-one. Mr. Fantastic was a card that went in a lot more places and frankly was a lot more, additive to a lot of people's experiences, where Star-Lord is a card that is negative to a lot of people's experiences. That said, I am really interested to see how people interpret this, because I feel like it is very reasonably fair to say Star-Lord deserved a nerf, but I also think that it is very reasonably fair to say, I really wish they didn't kill this card that I've invested in. I do think that he's still going to be around. If you're going to play high evolutionary, he's just very obviously good. You're just not comboing with him anymore. And I think when you put it like that, it sounds like a really good idea. I'm just really interested to see what community reception is on a card like this that was this build aroundy, getting changed to being much more of a standalone archetype only card. I think it's a better version of what they did with Mr. Fantastic First Steps, but that is still the comparison that I want to make. In terms of how this card is going to play out, I do think that the combos are largely dead. I'm not playing this in Mr. Negative anymore, I think, but it might just be worth building around as a card. Like this guy in High Evolutionary, 4 extra energy, 5/12, that seems like a legitimate thing. This is now a much better card in High Evo specifically than it was at any other time previous, because at other times previous, it had to compete with other Star-Lord decks. Is this card now good enough? And is the fact that High Evo alone will basically have good access to this card meaningful? The other thing you can do with this card, if you are not high evoing, is use him as Fallen One #2. So maybe we'll see a little bit more in the space of you play this as second Fallen One on your Symbiote Spider-Man, you play a bunch of Man-Spider Taskmaster things, that should still be on the table for him as well. So it's pretty clear to me that he will have roles in this new metagame, which is notably different from what it was with Mr. Fantastic First Steps. I do think this is a better version of that. I'm just really interested to see what reception is from the public. Cannonball losing a point of power feels like it happens every 3 months when they take a look at Cannonball doing things and they're like, oh yeah, maybe this shouldn't be a big part of what this card's profile is. I think that Cannonball losing a point of power is a fine enough thing to happen. I have no real objections to it. Fundamentally, this card has been defined by the Mercury interaction since Mercury came out, and before that was defined by the Professor X interaction that they had to change just because that interaction was so ridiculously powerful. It is defined by being in a Galactus card. It is defined by all of these things that make the moving of the card not really anything about what the card is doing, and the blowing up of the card the specific thing the card is balanced around. And so I think it's basically always fine to knock points off a card that unconditionally has the ability to kill the strongest thing in a lane. I'm never going to really object to that kind of balancing. I think it's just always going to be a reasonable thing to do. Gambit Horseman going to 6 required cost of cards played is, I think, a nod towards this card being a little bit too easy to have always on, thanks to Valentina, which will still work, and Iron Patriot, which will now work meaningfully less. The big question for me is, what is the Gambit package going to be? Because there's going to be a required amount of cards that generate other cards. You're going to talk about Gambit, you're going to talk about Valentina, that's a guarantee. Okay, Iron Patriot, and then what else? Is Iron Patriot Frigga enough to make this package be a reasonable thing to do? Or do you need another thing that's going to be able to generate cards as well? How many card generators do you need? How much do you need to build into Gambit? Largely, I think Gambit is a really interesting card. It is an attempt at taking a tech card and saying, we want the tech card to be a build-around. The problem you run into is then you need your build-around to be a tech card. You have created a tech card that needs build-around level payoff. And that's kind of where I don't like Gambit as a design. I think that while this is an interesting and cool thing to do, he's typically going to be very feast or famine based on how easy it is to access his power. He released, and it's very easy to access his power, and he's very, very powerful. You can really only balance that by making it harder to access his power over time by changing cards that are able to make it easy to bypass his restriction. The question is, once you do that, is anyone going to play the card at all? This is not like a Star-Lord situation where it's like, okay, I see this 5/8 Star-Lord. Yeah, you're getting rid of a lot of the Star-Lord decks that exist now, but I can still use this as Fallen 1 number 2. I can still play this in High Evolutionary. With Gambit, I think it's a lot different, where you're like, if you make this hard enough to actually happen, like that it actually doesn't happen a decent amount of the time, I might just not even play it, because you're playing him to be a solution. And when your solutions are unreliable, that's not really a tenable situation. I don't think we're there yet with Gambit. This 6 is probably going to mean that I'm going to play Iron Patriot, I'm going to play Valentina, I'm going to play a couple of other things. They also nerfed Frigga alongside Gambit, or maybe I should say buffed Frigga? Now, I realize, on its face, 3/3 to Frigga is not just a nerf, but a nerf that I have generally advocated for. The reason I'm going to say it might not be the best idea right now is because of Cerebro 3. Cerebro 3 gaining Frigga means that not only does it become an infinitely more reliable Cerebro deck, it also becomes an infinitely more reliable Gambit deck. Between Cerebro and, of course, Gambit, you're now going to have a bunch of ways to target something that is going to be meaningfully powerful at crushing mid-range decks. In addition, with the addition of Frigga, you now have Bastion and Sentinel and Frigga, which means Gambit may be a little bit harder, but you have better options for actually making it happen. This, I think, is a big buff to Cerebro 3, and I expect Cerebro 3 to be one of, if not the biggest winners of the entire patch. Gaining Frigga and increasing the consistency of your Gambit is a big deal. Cerebro 3 was already kind of a Gambit deck, but it needed to do some other stuff beyond just Bastion and Sentinel to actually reasonably hit that 5 often enough. Now it gets Frigga, which it already wants because it is a Cerebro deck, and that allows it to be a Gambit copy deck with Bastion and Frigga and also be a Cerebro copy deck with Bastion and Frigga, and also just raise the floor on your Gambit generally because you have more things that copy things profitably. Cerebro 3, genuinely, to me, the biggest winner of this patch. Now, I'm not really sure how to feel about this, because when you zoom out in aggregate, this is the right direction to go. For a while, my contention about Marvel Snap is that they put a lot of power into decks, or into cards like Frigga, into cards like Absorbing Man, into cards like Grandmaster, when those things were being meaningfully held back by tech. And over time, thanks to the release of new mechanics that don't necessarily have good tech cards for them, and I do think this is notable when you look at, like, Activates, Super Adaptoid legit sucks, End of Turns, Ghost legit sucks. We were in a world where the combination of Shang-Chi, Shadow King, and Enchantress could basically cover everything when they were putting these points of power on Grandmaster, on Absorbing Man, and on Frigga. We are no longer in that world, and so it does make sense to me to dial back the power on the things that say double. I think we've run into a lot of problems with things that say double in recent Marvel Snap metas, and it's a very reasonable critique to say we need to dial these back. Frigga specifically is one of the ones that you actually really want to dial back when Gambit is a popular thing. You don't want there to be a lot of people copying Gambits. That sounds horrendous. You got to take power out of that. The problem is, by putting it into Cerebro 3, I think they've created more Gambits. And it could be that I am vastly overestimating how many people are willing to play a deck that instantly loses 30% of its games. Maybe this is not going to be a serious problem outside of High Infinite. But to me, when I look at this, what I see is that I kind of expect Cerebro 3 to be the best deck in the game. Like, that is sort of what I look at. When I look at what Cerebro 3 has solutions for, it has Cosmo, it has Mobius, it has Gambit, it has Frigga output, it has so many powerful things going for it that, frankly, I can't imagine it not being one of the strongest decks in the game. I really expect this to be a big deal. So while directionally, I do think it's the right thing to do, and I also understand why they're like, well, what do you want us to do? Frigga to 3-2? Isn't that, like, way too much? Isn't that way, way, way over-indexing for how scared you are of C3? And it's like, yeah, okay, I get it. I don't really think, like, largely, when I look at this patch, what I see are solutions that navigate a tough road where I don't think I have any better answers, right? Like, if you pressed me on it, I might say that if they were interested in really balancing this, you'd take Frigga to 3-2 so you didn't run the Cerebro 3 risk. But I think the reaction to that amongst the populace at large would largely be, why would you murder Frigga like that? And I think that that's probably worse than running the risk of Cerebro 3 being a little bit too good. I just think that, like, again, it's sort of like with the Star-Lord thing where it's like, I think this is probably directionally the correct thing to do, but previous things that have happened have sort of built up to a situation where I don't know if there is a satisfying outcome, and you're trying to sort of split the Gordian knot, as it were. Like, that's just a difficult ask. And I think that this is close, but I'm really scared of C3. And I, like, what happened? Like, I guess the thing is, like, okay, if C3 becomes really good, solve that by changing Cerebro. And it's like, okay, fine, sure, I get it. But I do think that, like, all right, well, we made Gambit harder, but we also made Gambit a guaranteed C3 card, and we also made C3 way stronger. There might be more Gambits, and that's probably not what you want when you're nerfing a card like Gambit and Frigga. You know, you're nerfing Gambit and Frigga, and you kind of want their play rate to go down. And I think by giving them a new home, you might have made their play rate go up. Gorr is gaining 2 points of power, which could be a buff or a nerf, depending on how you think about it. I consider this one like I think this is cute, right? Because it going above 0 means that it's no longer Jane Fosterable in Mr. Negative, which is a deeply, like, you know, I'm not going to cut Gorr from my Mr. Negative deck. I'm going to keep playing him, right? Like, I'm going to do that. So I do think that, like, this is sort of a net gain in the sense that, like, maybe Gorr can become a more relevant 6. But I also think that that's mostly not likely to happen because of how many other mechanics have proliferated in Marvel Snap recently. It used to be like most of the cards you played were honor reveals, and now it's very much not like that for a wide variety of reasons, not the least of which being they've introduced several new mechanics, and also not the least of which being a lot of the reason you were like all about some on reveals and things of that nature was so that you could get your value out of the card before it got removed by a tech card. And so like that kind of stuff, like there are a couple dynamics here going on, but mostly I do think that they made a lot of cards that don't interact with Gorr in a meaningful way. I think that giving this guy power and making him more of a card people would play outside of cheating stuff is a good thing on the whole. I think that pigeonholing really any card into you only play this in Mr. Negative is a bad move. And I think that, you know, if they want to give this guy more power and actually commit to this, I think that's probably a good thing to do. Largely, I think that Mr. Negative is a fine deck to exist, but I don't think it's the kind of thing that should keep other things from seeing buffs. And I think that the argument that they shouldn't make Gorr stronger so that it can be good in this specific role as a Mr. Negative card is an argument that I don't particularly enjoy. I think that largely I would prefer if Gorr was some kind of halfway point between an actually playable card for its own stats and a card you ran in Mr. Negative for the high roll. Closer to an Iron Man, right? You'll sometimes see an Iron Man in like a Spectrum ongoing deck or whatever. That is a card that you do not need to cheat in order to play sometimes. Gorr has become a card that you only play when you're cheating. And I think that that is not necessarily the greatest thing in the world for a card like this to be, so I am generally in favor of the direction they're going here. Thor's Mjolnir is also getting a point of power, or giving an additional point of power, I should say. Thor at 3/5, Mjolnir now giving 7. I do think that this is a more meaningful buff than the 3/5 because a lot of Thor decks tend to be about multiplications on the zeros. Like you play the zeros in an Odin is sort of the baseline play pattern, but obviously there's like Misery, Fire Hair, all that kind of stuff too. Hammer Bros largely runs into a couple of problems, right? And this is going to be an oversimplification, so please understand I don't mean it entirely literally, but they're either going to be Wong decks or Sarah decks. And I'll explain what I mean by that is like a Wong deck would be, you know, the Fire Hair versions, the Odin versions, the Misery versions. What you're doing is trying to multiply the output of Beta Ray Bill and Thor's hammers by a large number and then have a bunch of points. That's one of the ways to play the deck. The other way to play the deck is typically using them as zeros, so they would be where the points come from on the final turn of the game, and then the rest of what you do on the final turn of the game is alternately either like Hitmonkey and a bunch of other stuff, or tech that removes your opponent's points at the end of the game. The problem is twofold. The first is that as a Wong deck, like if you're going to be Fire Hairing and Miserying, it's probably better to do something in that space that doesn't require you shuffle cards into your deck and thus make you less likely to draw the specific pieces of your combo than this. So like if you're going to be a Fire Hair deck, maybe you should be a different Fire Hair deck, you know? Maybe you should be doing the Fire Hair stuff in a different space. Maybe you should be playing a different kind of Fire Hair deck, like the zombie one with Phoenix Force. Maybe that's what should be happening instead of the Thors. And I don't think this change, and spoiler alert, Beta Ray Bill, his Strombreaker is also getting a 4th power. I guess we're going to talk about those at the same time. I don't think this change does anything to change that dynamic. And as for the sort of Sarah style decks, they aren't real. They haven't been real since they nerfed Shadow King to 3, really. I think, like, it used to be you could play 2 hammers, a Shadow King, and a Shang-Chi on the same turn of the game with 6 energy. That was kind of nice with it back in the day. We are no longer back in the day. Thing about the old days, they're the old days. Viv Vision going to 3/4 is, I think, kind of interesting because she's a card that's very sensitive to power on her. The more she is able to contribute to winning her own lane, the more it's actually just really good to have an enabler of her ilk. I know Zenade has been a big Viv Vision tempo kind of player for a while. I don't necessarily think that that kind of thing is immediately going to come back, but we do have a lot more room to mess around with that kind of stuff in a world where Star-Lord isn't just stomping on anyone trying to do anything fair. Like, Viv Vision giving you this buff repeatedly is a really good thing, and I do think that 3-4 is kind of the break point here, where it's like, okay, you're now like a real body. Like, you and like, if we just play you in an empty lane, we're probably good from there based on the buffs you're giving me. I can really get a lot of buffs on this and do something legitimately powerful. I don't think it's necessarily gonna be better than, say, a Sholau thing, because Sholau is just so much more multiplicative than Viv, but I do think that this is what takes her into like, oh, that's a real card, you're gonna see her, and she's actually gonna beat you sometimes territory. I do think this is like a meaningful buff to Viv Vision, where I think I would expect to see an amount of her running around. Strange Supreme is in a bit of a weird spot because Thanos lists have become even more about cards on the board than they previously were. Like, we had Thanos lists that were about cards on the board playing Spectrum, and Strange Supreme was pushing against it even then, right? Like, even then it was like, all right, you know, this is like a little bit less of an amazing card than I would like, but there are still versions that aren't Spectrum decks that I'm willing to play Strange Supreme in. Every Thanos deck is an Aurora deck now, 100% of them. And so he ends up being much more lateral when you are playing Aurora than Spectrum, because like everything he's eating is going to be something that would get a buff basically. And it's like, okay, I got 2 points of power out of eating that on the Strange Supreme, and I lost 2 points of power off of what would have been an Aurora for that. And so it's like, I think that this is a particularly meaningless buff, because I can't imagine wanting to play him and Aurora. Maybe I'm just way off base about that in a Thanos list, and it's just like, this is just a really good thing to do. He's still a really big guy. There's a lot more upside to being a really big guy in a world where Star-Lord isn't making really big guys look like really small guys. I get it. I just think that like this is basically a free change that they can do here that I don't think will meaningfully impact a lot of what I'm doing in the Thanos space, unless for some reason I'm getting rid of Aurora. I do think that it's notable though that like maybe this is worthwhile in a world where you're doing like, I play this guy in one lane, I play Iska in another lane, GG, that's 2 lanes, right? Like that kind of thing. Maybe that makes sense, but I do think that it would require some reworking of the Thanos archetype as it is currently constituted, built around Aurora. And I'm not necessarily sure that it's worth doing that, especially given how well Aurora can work with an Iska. Caiera gets a point of power up to 3-5, 4 thumbs up, 7 thumbs up, 8 thumbs up, as many thumbs up as I am legally allowed to give this. Great job. It's the rock card. I mean, no one wants to play this card if it's a 3-4. I'm not sure anyone wants to play it if it's a 3-5. It's a card you only put in your deck when you are forced to put it in your deck by other people playing Killmonger or Gambit or whatever, right? I would have made this card a 3-6 personally. Like, maybe that's a terrible idea. But I do think that this is the kind of thing that this part, at least going to 3-5, super free. Great job. Good. Make those rock people feel a little bit safer. Weapon X getting a point of power, don't think it's particularly meaningful, but another point of power. Like, it's the same thing with Caiera, right? Like, going to 3-5, all right, cool, nice, good job. Going to 2-3, all right, cool, nice, good job. What I really want is 3-6 and 2-4. Like, that's what I really want out of this. And then it would be like, okay, we're really talking now. But I don't really necessarily think that that's a reasonable ask. I do think that, like, look, if Shocker is 2-4, Weapon X can be a 2-4, you know? Like, I think that one's at least reasonable, where, like, 3-6 Caiera, maybe not as reasonable an ask. I would like to see just a little bit more points on what this guy does as a baseline, as a low roll that makes him worth actually putting in my deck. My secret pitch for this card, this is my secret pitch for this card. And keep in mind, I'm pretty sure it doesn't fit on the card, so they probably can't do it. But my secret pitch for this card is to make it a 1 cost and give it like regen text. Like, when it dies, it doesn't die. And it's a 1 cost, and then I just feel like I'd actually play the hell out of this card. Like, just make it a 1 cost that doesn't die when it would otherwise die, or that regenerates when it would otherwise die. I would play so much of this card. I really legitimately think that. And it's not that, and it is the 2 cost that is the biggest gap on this. Like, that and the fact that, like, you know, you play it and you're like, okay, I can't put anything that blows up there. Either one of those, but ideally both of those would be the direction I would go with this guy. All right, what do y'all think about this patch? I'm really interested to figure out what the community temperature on this is, because I do think that, like, I don't know. I don't want to say like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I think that this is a better nerf to Star-Lord than the nerf to Mr. Fantastic was to Mr. Fantastic. I think that Star-Lord will still be playable in some, maybe not even necessarily fringe, but no longer what they are exactly today kind of decks. I think he is a high Evo staple. I think he is a Fallen One, like that is Fallen One number 2 in your Man Spider deck. You are absolutely doing that. And in a world where people aren't playing all the Star-Lord stuff, Man Spider might go back to being the sort of dominant ceiling deck, and we might still see plenty of Star-Lord running around. So I think it's very possible that, like, there's going to be some overblown reactions to how dead he is, but I am interested to see how that one plays out. I'm also interested to see how people interact with Cerebro, right? Because I think they nerfed Gambit and Frigga with the intent of making them cards that people see less. I don't think it's going to do that, because I think they're going to be such staples in Cerebro. Outside of that, basically all thumbs up to everything that happened in this patch. Specifically, those 2 things, though, they are the biggest things that happen in this patch, and I really don't know how people are going to take them. So let me know in the comments. As always, I've been KMBest, you've been phenomenal, and I'll see you in the next one.